My name is Father Thomas Clarke. I was born and raised in a small town in Pennsylvania, but for most of my life, I've called the bustling city of Chicago my home. I was born into a Catholic family, steeped in tradition, and for as long as I can remember, my life was destined to be intertwined with the church. My parents, though humble, were pillars of the community, and their unwavering faith in God shaped every part of my upbringing. My father, a kind-hearted man with a rough exterior, always told me that I was chosen for a higher purpose. I never truly understood what he meant until much later. I had always felt a calling to the priesthood. From an early age, I knew that God had set me apart for something greater than just ordinary life. I entered seminary school at the age of 18, and by 26, I was ordained as a priest. That was when my journey truly began. I was assigned to one of the largest parishes in the city, Our Lady of Mercy, a bustling church with a vibrant community of believers. Life as a priest was everything I had dreamed of. I preached every Sunday, led countless masses, counseled parishioners through their struggles, and witnessed the lives of so many individuals change through the grace of God. I also had a family of sorts, my church family. There were those who looked up to me as a spiritual guide, who confided their deepest fears, desires, and sins in me. I had many friends within the clergy, men I had studied with, men I respected. My life seemed blessed, but beneath the surface there was always a quiet whisper, a question that I could never fully quiet. The question was simple, really. Is this enough? For all the success, for all the lives I touched, I still found myself searching for something deeper. I had a strong faith, of course. I had to, for my role as a spiritual leader. But in the silence of the night, when the world around me slept, I sometimes wondered if I truly understood the depth of God's love. Did I truly know Him? Or was I merely living out a role, following a script that was handed to me by the church? I couldn't say, and that doubt ate away at me in ways I couldn't explain to anyone, not even myself. I wasn't the only one. There were others in my community who wore masks of confidence and faith, who smiled as they sat in the pews, but who also carried a quiet sadness with them. I saw it in the eyes of the elderly woman who attended Mass every Sunday but could barely hold back her tears as she sat alone in her pew. I felt it in the nervous hands of the young man who came to me for counsel, struggling with addiction, but too afraid to fully confess his sins. We were all searching for something. Something. But what? And why did it feel as if there was always something missing? It was during one of those quiet moments of doubt that the storm of my life began to gather. I had just finished a long day of administering the sacrament of confession. The evening had been unusually exhausting. I had listened to confession after confession, each one heavier than the last. As I walked out into the evening air, the setting sun casting long shadows on the pavement, I felt a sense of weariness in my bones, a feeling I couldn't shake. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt off. The world seemed out of place. The next morning, everything changed. It was a rainy Wednesday, the kind of day that had no promise of light. I had been feeling unusually fatigued for the past few days. My head ached, my limbs felt heavy, and even the thought of prayer felt distant. But I pushed on, thinking it was simply exhaustion, nothing more. That morning, I was on my way to the church when I was suddenly hit by a sharp pain in my chest. It took me by surprise. I had no history of heart problems, no reason to believe anything was wrong. I staggered for a moment, my breath catching in my throat, before I collapsed onto the wet sidewalk. In that instant, the world around me began to fade. The sounds of the bustling city grew muffled, the rain falling in a strange, rhythmic pattern that seemed to come from somewhere deep within me. My heart raced as panic began to set in, but my vision blurred, and I couldn't focus on anything. I felt myself slipping away, sinking into a void. It wasn't fear that I felt, but something far deeper, something I had never known before. I remember thinking to myself, is this it? But before I could process any more thoughts, I felt myself being pulled away from my body, like a force gently lifting me into the air. It wasn't painful, it was strangely peaceful, though there was an undeniable sense of urgency to it. I tried to speak, to scream for help, but no sound escaped my lips. And then, in the distance, I saw a light. It wasn't like any light I had ever seen before. It was bright, yes, but it didn't burn. It wasn't harsh, it was pure, warm, and inviting. I felt the weight of it pulling me toward it, like a magnet. I was overwhelmed by the sensation of peace, a peace that seemed to penetrate every part of me, reaching places I had forgotten even existed. And then I saw him. At first, it was just a figure, a man standing in the light, his back to me. I couldn't make out his features clearly, but I knew instinctively that it was Jesus. I felt something stirring inside of me, something old, something primal, and I knew that this was no dream. This was real. "Come," he said, his voice soft but firm. There was a power in his words, a command that drew me in despite any hesitation I might have had. I stepped forward, and as I did, the world around me began to transform. The light grew brighter, but it was no longer blinding. Instead, it surrounded me, enveloped me in a warmth that I had never known. There were no words at first, no instructions, just an overwhelming sense of love. A love so deep, so vast, that I felt as though I was drowning in it. Every part of me, every fiber of my being responded to it. It was in this moment that I realized how little I had understood about love. All my years in the church, all my preaching about God's love for his people had been incomplete. I had never truly known love until this moment. I had never truly felt the depth of God's heart for me. The figure turned to face me. Jesus. His eyes, though not fully visible in the bright light, shone with a depth of compassion that made my heart ache. "You've been living a lie," he said, his voice a gentle whisper that cut through the very core of my being. "You have been hiding from the truth." The words stung. They weren't harsh, but they were undeniable. I felt the weight of them like a burden on my soul. It was as though every doubt I had ever had about my faith, every question that had lingered in the silence of my heart, had suddenly been exposed. "You know what you must do, Thomas," he continued. "You cannot keep pretending. You must face the truth that has always been there, but you have been too afraid to see it." Tears welled in my eyes, and I fell to my knees. In that moment, I knew that everything I had lived for, everything I had worked for, had been built on a fragile foundation, a foundation of half-truths, of fear, and of doubt. But the truth that he spoke, the truth that he was offering me, was something else entirely, something real. And in that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. I woke up suddenly, gasping for air as the sound of my own breath filled the space around me. The weight of what I had just experienced, what I had just seen, pressed down on me with a force that made my heart race. For a split second, I wondered if it had all been a dream, if the encounter, the light, the voice of Jesus had been the product of a weary mind. But I knew better. The truth of that moment was undeniable. I had been touched by something far beyond human comprehension. As I sat up, I found myself on the sidewalk, soaked from the rain that had continued to fall as I lost consciousness. I could feel the cold, the wetness of my clothes, but none of it mattered. The experience, the presence I had felt, it was still with me, burning inside me like a flame that refused to be extinguished. I tried to gather my thoughts, but they scattered. A whirlwind of confusion, fear, and wonder. What had just happened? What had I seen? Was it real? And what did it all mean? As I looked around, trying to regain my bearings, I realized I was still in the city, still in Chicago, still standing on the very same street I'd collapsed on just moments before. But everything seemed different now. The buildings loomed over me, their harsh lines now softened by a light I couldn't explain. The people passing by seemed unaware of the transformation I had just undergone, like going about their business with no knowledge of the profound moment that had changed everything for me. A voice called my name, and I turned to find a paramedic kneeling beside me. "Father Clarke, are you all right?" he asked, his face concerned but calm. I nodded, though I was far from all right. The weight of what I had experienced crushed me. I was alive, yes, but something deep within me had died, a part of my former self that I could never reclaim. And with it, all the doubts I had buried for so long had come rushing to the surface. The paramedics checked me over, but there was no clear medical explanation for what had happened. My heart was fine, my vitals stable, and yet I felt like I'd crossed into a different realm, a place where the rules of life and death no longer applied. As I left the hospital later that day, the sense of confusion only deepened. How could I return to my normal life after this? How could I return to preaching and performing my duties as a priest when I now carried the weight of such a profound revelation? I had always believed I was doing God's work. I had always felt that I was the faithful servant, the one chosen to spread his word, to guide his people. But now, in the aftermath of that encounter, I was unsure of everything. The truth that Jesus had spoken to me was clear, but it was also frightening. I had lived a life built on a foundation of religious certainty, on rituals and duties that I had come to view as unquestionable. But Jesus had shown me something else, something far more radical, far more personal. He had shown me that my faith had been incomplete, that I had been hiding from the deeper truths of God's love. I had been afraid to see the full extent of God's love, afraid to acknowledge the doubts I had buried deep within me, afraid to face the truth about myself. The moment he spoke those words, it felt as though the very fabric of my existence was torn apart. The certainty I had once felt about my life and my purpose seemed to slip away like sand through my fingers. For the first time in my life, I felt utterly lost. And yet, at the same time, there was a new sense of clarity, a clarity that shook me to my core. I had been given a glimpse of a truth so vast, so overwhelming, that there was no way I could return to my old life without first confronting it head on. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I couldn't escape the image of Jesus, his words echoing in my mind. "You have been living a lie." The weight of those words pressed on me like an unrelenting storm. But there was something else I couldn't shake. The love. The love I had felt in his presence was indescribable, a love so pure and so deep that it made everything else seem insignificant. It was a love that transcended everything I had ever known, a love that existed outside of time, outside of the confines of human understanding. And in that love, I felt as though all my doubts, all my questions had been met with the compassion and grace I had always longed for. But that didn't make everything easier. I knew that the life I had built, my career as a priest, my place in the church, my role as a leader in the community, was built on shaky ground. The life I had lived was no longer enough. And worse, I knew that the church itself, the institution I had devoted my life to, was complicit in its own form of denial. We had all been living a lie, pretending that the outward rituals and the words we spoke were enough to heal the deep wounds that lay hidden within. It was a painful realization, one that left me questioning everything I had ever stood for. But even in the pain, there was a sense of freedom, a liberation that came with the knowledge that I was no longer bound by the illusions I had once held dear. I knew what I had to do. I had to face the truth. And in doing so, I knew that everything in my life would change. I didn't know how, or even if it was possible to make such a drastic shift, but I could no longer ignore the calling that was now louder than ever. The following days were a blur. I tried to go about my duties as usual, to perform the rituals, to serve the congregation, but every time I stood at the altar, I felt like a fraud. My faith had been cracked open, and now the truth was leaking through the cracks. I found myself alone in my office more and more often, staring at the crucifix on the wall, wondering how I could reconcile the life I had led with the truth I had encountered in that other realm. What did it mean to truly follow Jesus? What did it mean to love him, to serve him, if everything I had believed was built on a lie, and yet I knew one thing for sure: I could never go back. In the weeks that followed, the walls of my life began to close in on me. The weight of my doubts and the revelation I had experienced on the other side of life seemed to grow heavier with every passing day. I tried to push the feelings away, to return to the comfort of my old routines, but it was no use. The truth was a shadow that clung to every moment, lurking in every corner of my mind. The church continued to function as it always had, but for me, it had lost its meaning. The rituals I once performed with fervor now felt empty. The prayers I had recited with conviction seemed hollow, as if they were being spoken by someone else, someone who no longer existed. The community I had once led with authority now felt distant, as if I no longer belonged. I remember one Sunday standing before my congregation, delivering a sermon that I had prepared with care. The words flowed from my lips, but I could feel the disconnection. It was as if I was speaking in a foreign language, unable to bridge the gap between my former beliefs and the reality of what I had encountered. The eyes of my parishioners were fixed on me, their faces filled with reverence, but I saw nothing but emptiness in their gazes. I had once believed that I was their guide, their shepherd, but now I felt like a fraud. I was no longer capable of leading them with the same confidence and certainty I had once possessed. I had been shown something that shattered everything I had known, and yet I felt powerless to share it with anyone. How could I speak of this profound experience, this revelation of divine love, when it contradicted everything the church stood for? How could I tell them of the overwhelming presence of Jesus, of the truth he had shown me, when I knew it would be met with resistance, disbelief, and fear? The isolation I felt grew unbearable. I withdrew from my friends, my colleagues, and even my family. I no longer knew how to relate to the people I had once been so close to. Every conversation seemed strained, every interaction marked by an unspoken tension. I was trapped in a world that no longer made sense, and there seemed to be no way out. It wasn't just the church that felt foreign to me, it was everything. The life I had built seemed like a facade, a carefully constructed illusion that had been shattered by the encounter I had experienced. I had thought I was living a dream life, but now I saw that it was nothing more than a mirage, a series of empty promises. The doubt I had always kept hidden deep within me was now exposed, raw and undeniable. The questions I had pushed aside for years, questions about the nature of God, the purpose of suffering, the meaning of faith, all came rushing to the forefront. I had spent my life trying to answer those questions with formulas, with theology, with rituals, but now none of those answers seemed adequate. I needed something deeper, something more personal. I needed to know the truth. I began to spend more time in solitude, praying, or at least trying to pray. I would sit in my small apartment, staring at the crucifix, asking God to show me the way. I asked for clarity, for guidance, for understanding. But all I received in return was silence. And in that silence, I found both peace and frustration. One evening, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. The city, once bustling with life and energy, now felt like a distant dream. The streets seemed empty, the people walking by unaware of the turmoil I was experiencing. I wandered aimlessly, not knowing where I was going or why. It was then that I stumbled upon a small chapel, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. I had passed it countless times before, but had never noticed it. Something compelled me to enter. I walked inside, the cool air of the chapel wrapping around me like a blanket. The space was dimly lit, the faint scent of incense hanging in the air. I sat in one of the pews, my eyes fixed on the altar. The silence in the room was profound, almost tangible. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to sink into the stillness, hoping for some kind of answer, some kind of reassurance. And then, in the midst of that silence, I felt it again. The presence. The overwhelming sense of love, the same love I had felt in the spiritual realm. It was as if Jesus was sitting beside me, his hand on my shoulder, his voice whispering words of comfort and truth. I could feel him, not with my senses, but with my heart, his love pouring into me like a river, filling every corner of my being. "You have always been loved, my child," his voice echoed softly in my mind. "You have always been chosen." Tears began to well up in my eyes, not from sorrow, but from the sheer magnitude of what I was experiencing. This wasn't a dream, this was real. The love I had encountered was real, and though I had doubts, though I questioned everything, that love was unwavering, unchanging, and eternal. In that moment, I knew that I could no longer deny what I had experienced. The truth was too powerful, too undeniable. But I also knew that this truth would come at a cost. As the days passed, I began to feel the full weight of that cost. The decision to embrace the truth I had encountered would mean leaving behind the life I had known, the life I had built in the church, in my community, in my family. It would mean standing alone, facing rejection, facing isolation. It would mean a complete transformation of my very identity. But even as the fear of loss gripped me, I also felt a sense of peace. I knew that the love I had encountered in the spiritual realm was more than enough. It was everything. And though the road ahead would be difficult, I knew that I could no longer ignore the call that had been placed on my heart. I was no longer the man I had been. The person who had once stood at the altar with certainty and pride was gone. In his place was someone new, someone who had seen the truth, who had experienced the divine love that transcended everything. And though the journey ahead would be long and uncertain, I was no longer afraid. The days that followed my encounter in the chapel felt surreal. I was caught between two worlds, each pulling me in opposite directions. The one I had known, my life as a priest, my role in the church, my identity as a leader of faith, seemed to have lost its foundation. The other world, the one I had glimpsed in my near-death experience, was filled with overwhelming love, truth, and the undeniable presence of Christ. I was no longer sure where I belonged. As I walked the familiar streets of the city, my steps felt heavier than before. The very ground beneath me seemed foreign. I had always considered myself a man of faith, a servant of God, but now I was beginning to question everything I had ever been taught. Was my faith truly built on a foundation of truth? Or was I simply following a tradition, a set of beliefs that had been handed down to me without ever questioning their validity? I was filled with an unrelenting sense of longing. I yearned for something more, something deeper than the rituals I had once embraced. I could no longer reconcile the teachings of the church with the profound experience I had had with Jesus. The love I had encountered was not something that could be confined within the walls of any institution. It was boundless, all-encompassing, and unconditional. But as much as I felt drawn to this new understanding of God, I also feared the consequences of embracing it fully. The world I had known would never accept the changes that were unfolding in my heart. The church, with all its rules and regulations, its doctrines and dogma, would not tolerate a priest who questioned its teachings. My community, the very people I had devoted my life to serving, would see me as a heretic, a traitor to the faith. I wrestled with these thoughts day and night, unable to find peace. I would wake up in the early hours of the morning, my mind racing, my heart torn between two opposing forces. One part of me longed to return to the church, to pick up where I had left off, to regain the respect and admiration I had once commanded. But another part of me, the part that had encountered the living Christ, rejected the notion of returning to a life of empty rituals and meaningless prayers. I could no longer pretend that everything was fine, that I had the answers, that I was in control. The tension within me grew unbearable. I began to lose focus at work, my sermons feeling increasingly disconnected from my own reality. I no longer felt like I was speaking with conviction. Instead, I felt like I was reciting lines from a script, words that no longer held the same weight. My parishioners, who had once looked up to me, began to notice the change. I could see it in their eyes, the doubt, the concern. They didn't say anything, but I could feel their questions hanging in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. It was during one of these sermons that I felt the breaking point approaching. As I stood before my congregation, I could sense the dissonance between what I was saying and what I now believed. The words felt like a betrayal, a lie I could no longer live with. I had come to the realization that my heart was no longer in the role I had been playing. I could no longer pretend that I was the man I once was. As I spoke the final words of the sermon, I saw the faces of the congregation, their eyes fixed on me, waiting for something, a sign, perhaps, that I still held the truth. But I had no answers for them anymore. I was no longer the confident priest they had known. I was just a man struggling to understand his place in a world that no longer made sense. After the service, I retreated to my office, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. I sat at my desk, staring at the papers before me, the silence in the room deafening. I felt a deep sense of loss, as if the life I had built had crumbled away before my eyes. I was no longer sure who I was, or what I was meant to do. That night, I went to bed with the same overwhelming sense of uncertainty. I prayed, though I wasn't sure who I was praying to anymore. The God I had once known seemed distant. And yet, in my heart, I still felt his presence. I still felt the love that had been revealed to me in the spiritual realm. It was a love that transcended all understanding, a love that offered no judgment, no condemnation. It was a love that simply accepted me for who I was, doubts and all. In the midst of my confusion, I heard a voice. It wasn't audible, but it was clear in my heart. "Trust in me," the voice said. "I have not abandoned you. I am with you always." Tears filled my eyes as I realized that the love I had encountered was still with me, even in the darkest moments of my doubt. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: I was not alone. The next day, I made the decision to take a leave of absence from the church. I knew it would be a difficult choice, one that would lead to criticism, rejection, and perhaps even excommunication. But I also knew that I could no longer live a lie. I had to follow the truth that had been revealed to me, no matter where it led. I left my position as a priest, stepping away from the life I had known for so long. It was a painful decision, one that tore at my heart, but I knew it was the right one. I was no longer willing to conform to the expectations of others. I had to walk my own path, even if it meant walking alone. The days that followed were filled with fear and uncertainty. I was no longer sure of where I was going or what I was meant to do. I had no job, no community, no support system. But I also felt a sense of freedom, a sense of peace that I had never known before. I no longer had to hide behind the facade of my old life. I was free to explore the truth, to seek a deeper understanding of God and of myself. I spent my days in prayer and reflection, seeking guidance from the divine presence that had never left me. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life, not as a priest, but as a man of faith, seeking the truth in every moment. I no longer had all the answers, but I knew that the journey was just beginning. And though I faced rejection from many in my former community, I also found new connections, new friends who shared in my quest for truth. I was no longer alone in my doubts, my struggles, or my questions. I had found a new family, a new community, bound together by a shared desire to seek the love and truth of God without the constraints of tradition or doctrine. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but I also knew that it was the only road worth walking. The weeks that followed my departure from the church were a blur of emotions. In the silence that surrounded me, I found myself confronting the very core of who I was. It wasn't just a matter of leaving the priesthood. It was a complete dismantling of everything I had once believed to be true. For so many years, I had defined myself by my vocation, my role as a priest, my duty to lead others in faith. But now, in the absence of that identity, I was forced to reckon with the reality of my own soul. Each day, I woke up with a strange sense of purpose, yet also a deep sense of loss. There was a part of me that missed the life I had known, the structure, the certainty, the respect that came with wearing the collar. People had always looked to me for guidance, for comfort, for answers. Now I was left with nothing but questions. And in the absence of answers, I found myself grappling with doubt on a scale I had never experienced before. I couldn't shake the vision of Jesus that had come to me during my near-death experience. The overwhelming love, the presence that filled me with peace and joy beyond anything I had ever known. It was a truth that had shattered the walls of my carefully constructed reality. And yet, in the wake of that experience, I struggled to reconcile what I had encountered with the teachings I had spent years preaching. Was Jesus really the same as the Christ I had preached about in church? The one who demanded moral purity, who judged sin, who held out the threat of hell for the unrepentant? The Christ I had encountered seemed so different. He was not distant or judgmental. He was not wrathful or condemning. He was love incarnate, unconditional, a love that embraced every part of me, even the parts I had hidden from myself. But the more I wrestled with this new understanding, the more I realized how isolated I had become. My old friends, my colleagues in the church could never understand what I had experienced. They would never believe that Christ could be so radically different from the figure they had been taught to worship. And yet, I could not turn away from the truth that had been revealed to me. It was as if I had been given a glimpse into the heart of God, and I could not unsee it. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in a park, staring out at the horizon, trying to make sense of everything. The trees were swaying gently in the breeze, and the sound of children playing nearby seemed to ground me in the present moment. I had spent so much time lost in my own thoughts, in my own confusion, that I had forgotten to look around and appreciate the simple beauty of life. As I sat there, I was approached by a man who appeared to be homeless. His clothes were tattered, and his face was weathered from years of hardship. But there was something in his eyes, a depth, a wisdom, a peace that seemed to emanate from him despite his outward appearance. He sat down beside me without asking, as if he had known I needed someone to talk to. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. I nodded, not sure why I felt compelled to let him stay, but something about his presence felt different, calming, almost like a balm for my restless soul. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the distant chatter of the children and the rustling of leaves, and then, without warning, he turned to me and said, "You're searching for something, aren't you?" His words struck me with the force of a lightning bolt. It was as if he had seen into the very depths of my soul, recognizing the turmoil and confusion I had been trying to hide. I didn't answer him at first, unsure of how to respond. But after a moment of silence, I nodded. "I'm not who I used to be," I said quietly, my voice betraying the pain I had been carrying. "I've lost everything. My faith, my identity, my community. I don't even know who I am anymore." The man smiled gently as if he had expected nothing less. "That's the thing, isn't it?" he said. "We spend our whole lives searching for something to hold on to, something that will give us meaning. But the truth is, the only thing worth holding on to is love. And love can't be found in anything outside of you. It's already inside of you, waiting to be recognized." I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. His words didn't make sense at first, but deep down, something resonated within me. It was as if he had just spoken the key to a door I hadn't even known existed. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice filled with skepticism. "I don't understand." The man's eyes softened, and he leaned in closer. "You've seen love, haven't you? The love that you felt when you met Christ. That's the love that's in all of us. It's not about being good enough or following the rules. It's about recognizing that we are already loved just as we are. No matter what we've done, no matter where we've been. Love is unconditional. It doesn't ask for anything in return. It just is." I felt a lump form in my throat as I absorbed his words. The weight of his statement sank in, and I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of peace. It was the same peace I had felt when I encountered Christ. The same love, the same presence. And for the first time since that moment, I felt like I was on the right path. For hours, the man and I talked, sharing our stories, our struggles, and our hopes. He told me about his own journey, how he had once been a successful businessman, but had lost everything: his family, his fortune, his sense of purpose. Yet in the midst of his own loss, he had found a deeper connection to God, a God who was not bound by labels, doctrines, or institutions. "You can't find God by searching for him outside of yourself," he said. "He's already here, in your heart. You just have to let go of all the things you think you know and trust that the truth will find you." That conversation changed everything for me. I realized that I had been looking for God in all the wrong places. I had been searching for him in the doctrines of the church, in the approval of others, in the performance of my duties. But the truth I had been seeking was not out there. It was in me, waiting to be discovered. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. The turmoil, the confusion, the fear, it all seemed to fade away. I no longer felt the need to prove myself or justify my existence. I was enough, just as I was, and that was enough to carry me forward. I knew that my journey was far from over. There were still questions, still doubts, still challenges to face, but I also knew that I was not alone. I had found a deeper connection to God, and I was learning to trust that love would guide me wherever I needed to go. The days after that conversation in the park were both quiet and tumultuous. I found myself waking each morning with a new perspective, one that was both liberating and terrifying. I had always been someone who valued certainty, someone who sought to build my life on firm ground, free from the shifting sands of doubt. But now, I realized that the certainty I had once clung to was an illusion. It was a construct I had built to protect myself from the deeper, more uncomfortable truths of existence. In the past, I had defined my life by the role I played as a priest, a leader of faith. I had been part of something larger than myself, a structure that provided purpose, direction, and meaning. But now, without that identity, I felt as though I was drifting. I was no longer sure of who I was or even who I was meant to be. The image I had once had of myself as a man of faith was now fractured, and it hurt. I still remembered that vision, that encounter with Christ, The way he looked at me with such profound love and compassion, as if he saw beyond my faults, beyond my failings. It had changed me in ways that I could hardly express. For the first time, I felt the weight of my own humanity in a way that was both humbling and freeing. I had always believed that I had to be perfect, that I had to live up to some ideal of holiness to be worthy of God's love. But Christ had shown me that my worth was not based on my perfection, but on my humanity, on my willingness to accept love, to let it flow through me, and to give it freely to others. And yet, even with this new understanding, I found myself standing at a crossroads. I had walked away from the church, but that did not mean the church had walked away from me. The pressure, the expectations, and the judgments were still there, lurking in the background. My family, my friends, and former colleagues all had their opinions. They could not understand the change that had come over me, nor could they accept it. To them, I was abandoning everything that had once defined me. And in many ways, I was. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I was not abandoning the faith. I was not abandoning Christ. I was simply walking away from the institution that I had believed held the exclusive truth. And I was willing to sacrifice my past, my reputation, and my identity in the priesthood for something far greater, a deeper, truer relationship with God, one that did not rely on human structures or expectations. I had begun to question everything, the doctrines, the rituals, the traditions. I had once believed they were essential to my connection with God, but now I saw them differently. They were tools, yes, but not the essence of faith. They were meant to help us connect to the divine, but they were not the divine itself. I spent countless hours in prayer, searching for clarity, trying to understand what my next steps should be. My heart was heavy with the realization that the path ahead would not be easy. I knew I would face rejection. I knew I would lose friends. And I knew that the weight of the church's authority would continue to bear down on me, even as I walked away from it. But I also knew that I could no longer live a life of silence, pretending that the truth I had encountered wasn't real. One afternoon, I found myself back at the church, standing outside the building that had once been my home. I had not entered the sanctuary in weeks, but something drew me back that day. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the courtyard. As I stood there, memories flooded my mind. I remembered the countless sermons I had preached, the baptisms, the weddings, the funerals, all of the moments that had defined my life in that sacred space. But now, as I stood in front of the church, I felt an overwhelming sense of separation. I no longer belonged there. The walls that had once felt so familiar now seemed foreign. I could feel the weight of judgment in the air, as if the building itself was condemning me for what I had chosen to do. As I turned to leave, I was stopped by a voice calling my name. Father Andrew. I turned, and standing behind me was Father Thomas, a man I had once considered a close friend, a mentor. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a sadness that seemed to pierce me. "I've been hearing things," he said softly, "about you, about your decision to leave the priesthood." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. The lump in my throat made it difficult to speak. "Why?" he asked, his voice tinged with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Why would you walk away from everything you've built, everything you've dedicated your life to?" I took a deep breath, my mind racing for the right words. How could I explain this to him? How could I convey the depth of the transformation I had experienced, the radical change in my understanding of God? I haven't abandoned my faith, Father," I said quietly. "I haven't abandoned Christ. I'm just learning to see him in a way that I never did before." Father Thomas frowned, clearly struggling to understand. "But you've spent your whole life preaching the gospel, teaching the faith. You can't just throw all of that away." "I'm not throwing it away," I replied, my voice growing firmer. "But I'm no longer willing to uphold a system that I believe is limiting our understanding of God. Christ doesn't need us to be perfect, Father. He doesn't need us to follow a set of rules. He needs us to love ourselves, to love others, and to love him. That's the gospel, not the doctrines and the rituals." For a long moment, Father Thomas said nothing. His face remained etched with confusion, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or a hint of sadness. Finally, he spoke again, his voice soft. "I don't know if I can understand what you're saying, Andrew," he said, "but I know you've always been someone who followed your heart. Just be careful. The road you're walking is not an easy one." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. I knew that he was right. The path I was choosing was fraught with difficulty, with loss, and with loneliness. But it was also the path that felt true to me. I had seen the truth of God's love in a way that transcended the confines of the church, and I could not turn away from it. As I walked away from the church, I felt a sense of peace that I had not known before. I was no longer bound by the expectations of others, no longer trying to live up to a false ideal of holiness. I was simply walking in the light of love, the love I had encountered in my near-death experience, the love that had transformed me, and the love that I now knew was the very essence of God. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I would find a new community, a new way of living out my faith. But I knew that I was no longer afraid. The truth I had found in Christ was enough to carry me forward, no matter where the road led. The days that followed my conversation with Father Thomas were both isolating and liberating. It was as if I had stepped into a new world, one where I no longer recognized the rules, the faces, or even the familiar buildings I had once relied upon. Everything around me seemed distant, like a dream I had once lived. But now I was awake, painfully, blissfully awake. I spent a lot of time alone. The silence of my apartment was often overwhelming. I had lived for so long within the walls of the church, surrounded by the community, the prayers, the rituals, but now there was nothing but space. And in that space, I found myself confronted with my own thoughts, my own questions. What was I supposed to do now? Where did I fit into a world that had no place for a former priest, someone who had walked away from everything he had once believed in? I couldn't escape the isolation. The church had been my life for so long, and the people I had known there were still part of my heart. Yet, as I stepped away from that life, I realized that my separation wasn't just from the institution, it was from a part of myself I had ignored for years. I had become so wrapped up in the roles I played, in the expectations of others, that I had forgotten to listen to my own soul. And now I was finally hearing it. Every night, I would sit by my window staring out at the city lights. Chicago, the place I had once called home, now felt like an alien landscape. The sounds of traffic, the bustle of people, the hum of the world, it all felt distant. But in that distance, I found clarity. I had been so focused on what I had to do for others, on fulfilling my duties as a priest, that I had never truly listened to my own heart. I had never asked myself what I truly believed, what I truly needed from life. I remember one evening when the silence seemed almost unbearable. I took a walk through the neighborhood, trying to shake off the weight of my thoughts. As I walked, I noticed a small church tucked away on a quiet street, one I had never seen before. Something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the simplicity of the building, or perhaps it was the feeling that I needed to reconnect with something greater than myself. I pushed open the door and entered. The church was empty, save for the flickering candlelight that illuminated the altar. I sat in the pews, my heart heavy with emotion. I wasn't sure what I was searching for. I wasn't sure if I was looking for forgiveness, for answers, or simply for a sense of peace. As I sat there, I closed my eyes and prayed. For the first time in weeks, I felt the presence of God. It wasn't the institutional God I had once preached about. It wasn't the God of rules and structures. It was the God I had encountered in that near-death experience, the God of love, of grace, of understanding. The God who saw me not as a priest or a sinner, but as a child, a beloved child full of imperfections and yet worthy of love. That night, I made a decision. I would not return to the life I had left behind, but I would also not abandon my faith. I had seen too much, felt too much, to deny the truth of that experience. Christ had shown me a love that went beyond human understanding, beyond dogma and tradition. It was a love that was unbound by the limitations of religion. And that love, I knew, was enough. I began to reach out to others who had experienced similar struggles, people who had left the church, people who had questioned their faith. I found a small group of like-minded individuals who were also searching for something more, something real. We would meet in quiet corners of coffee shops or in living rooms, sharing our stories, our doubts, our struggles, and our hopes. It wasn't a church, not in the traditional sense, but it was a community of people who had found something beyond the walls of any building, beyond the restrictions of any institution. I started to volunteer at a homeless shelter, working with those who had no one else. I spent my days listening to their stories, offering what little comfort I could, and in their faces I saw the reflection of my own pain, my own search for meaning. We were all, in our own way, lost, but we were also all searching for the same thing: love. One afternoon, I received a call from my mother. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and I could hear the worry in her words. "Andrew," she said, "there's something I need to tell you." I listened as she explained that Father Thomas had been concerned about me, that he had tried to reach out to the bishop and other members of the church, urging them to intervene. It was clear to me then that my decision to leave the priesthood had not gone unnoticed. The church had not forgotten me, and they weren't happy about my departure. The weight of their disapproval felt heavy on my shoulders, but it wasn't the rejection that stung the most. It was the realization that I had hurt my family, that they too were now living in the shadow of my choices. They had always been proud of me, and I had always taken comfort in their support. But now I could sense their disappointment. Still, I couldn't go back. I couldn't undo the transformation I had undergone. The peace I had found in my heart, the clarity I had gained in my soul, was something I could never relinquish. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The journey I had embarked on was difficult, and at times it felt impossible. But I knew deep down that I was walking the right path. The road was narrow, and it was lonely, but it was also filled with purpose. And with each step, I felt closer to the truth I had been seeking. I had no idea what the future held. I didn't know if I would ever reconcile with the church, with my family, or with the community I had left behind. But I knew that I was no longer living for others, no longer seeking their approval. I was living for God, for myself, and for the love that had transformed me. In the end, I realized that the true measure of faith was not in the rituals, not in the doctrines, not in the traditions. It was in love. And love, I had learned, was boundless. It didn't belong to any church, any institution, any one person. It belonged to all of us. And so with that love as my guide, I took the first steps into a new life, a life of faith that was not defined by titles or expectations, but by the truth I had discovered in my own heart. I was no longer a priest. I was no longer defined by the past. I was simply a man walking in the light of love, a light that would never fail me, no matter where I went. And as I walked, I knew I was no longer alone.